I missed it. I missed the timing on it. Damn it. I was adjusting my camera. I hate when I screw up like that. Whatever. It contributes to things being more organic or something like that. Okay. So today we're going to be reviewing a video. Let's get into the Lance loot. All right, Modern Moralist. Okay, you keep saying you love me. I don't know what's up with that, but I appreciate it. I love you too. Why not? Why not? Trust. I'm not drinking beer. Maybe you think I am because I'm saying that, but you get 1,000 Lance loot, and you know what? Because you love me, you get 100 more. So 1,100 Lance loot for Modern Moralist. Superior, you get 500. I already got the video up, so I like you, Lance. There's hesitance. There's a lack of enthusiasm there. I don't trust it. I don't trust it. I also like the video. Okay, 50 Lance loot for that, so you get 550. All right, and Mama June's guacamole. I love guacamole. So you get 250 Lance loot, and then you get another 50 because you like guacamole. I don't know. So you get 300 Lance loot. All right, and Beef Brain, you're a little bit too late. All right, so I'm gonna be responding to this video. I think it came out like a few hours ago. Like it's like super recent. Let me actually check it. No, that's not it. Where is this video? Whatever. Anyway, so the video is like super recent. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna check. I think it came out like a few hours ago. Yeah. All right. 9 hours ago. Yeah, and it's only got 16 views. So I put a link in the description. They have about as many subscribers as me, or do I have? Oh no. I got like. Anyway, so go check that channel out. Give them a subscription. It looks like I don't. You know what? Actually, I don't know what else is on the channel, but I liked the video, even though I'm going to be critical of it. I like how people just throw out theories and say what they're going to do in a video, and then they go ahead and do it. What the hell does that mean? They say what they're going to do, and then people do that in all kinds of videos, and a lot of those videos suck. Anyway, I like this video, even though I'm going to be critical of it. I'm being extra weird today. I don't know what. Maybe I am drinking. It's not in my drink. It's tea, if you're wondering. Why would you wonder? Why would you care? All right. All right. Let's get into it. We'll take a look at the chat, and then we'll get into the video. And I'll try to dial down the weirdness. Okay, Modern Moralist says, how are you adjusting to fatherhood? Pretty good. She sleeps well. I'm going to have to go. I have to cut this short by 8, so I have less than an hour and a half now because I got to prepare a bath for her tonight, and we always feed her after the bath, try to have an established routine. We're doing it pretty early tonight. Sometimes it's more like 9. But tonight's a little early. Her eating schedule has been a little funny today. All right. Yeah, we need to get you to 3K by Christmas. We could try. If you want to go out and share my videos and pump me up out there, get me up in the algorithm, do it. This isn't the kind of channel that's generating a lot of money for YouTube, so I doubt I'm super. So, if you want to go out and share it and like the video and do all that stuff, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Yeah, classic advice for writing a paper or giving a speech. Modern says you'll make a great father. I'll try. All right, let's get into the video. So they got a new argument for moral realism for us. They recognize it's not particularly new, but they're working on something related to it. So they recognize various whatever. I'll let them speak for themselves, and then I'll give critical commentary. Let's bring the video back up. Oh, so this person is Thomas. I don't know how to say the name. Cahill. So yeah, go check out their stuff afterwards. All right, let's do it.
So I have something of a different kind of video today. Famous philosophers like Aristotle or Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, and sometimes I'll put these thinkers in dialogue with more modern thinkers, usually through the lens of trying to prove a theistic worldview. But today I'm going to do something different, because today I have an argument that I've been working on for the last several weeks. It's an argument for moral realism. And this is somewhat original to myself. I'm not going to claim that it's totally original, because that's not true. I mean, other philosophers have proposed similar arguments to the one that I came up with in the last few weeks, but it's kind of the most original thing I've done so far. So what I want to do in this video is go over this argument. I want to present it to you and I want you guys to give me feedback on it, because it's only through.
All right. So I'm going to give you feedback on it. And of course, I take pretty much the opposite view of what this argument's going to be. And you'll all see that pretty quickly as soon as you start seeing it laid out. So I'm doing a video response. Maybe I'll go leave a comment over there and tell them that I'm doing a video response so they know about it, or maybe tag them or whatever. And then hopefully there'll be some kind of dialogue or exchange that we could get going.
Getting feedback, then I can make this argument stronger. And to be honest with you, the production value on this video is not going to be as high as it usually is, because I still have a lot more work on this argument before it's finalized, and I don't want to put all this work into making this video really nice and have this not be my finalized version of this argument. So in this video, I'm basically just going to be presenting enough of my paper to give you guys a gist of my argument so that you can give me some feedback on it. That's the goal. And I know you guys won't let me down on that, because if there's anything I know about my viewers, it's that you guys really like philosophy and you really like poking holes in my arguments, which is great. I love it. But this is your time to shine. This is your time to poke as many holes as you want. I want you to poke the holes. Basically, my argument for moral realism that I'm proposing in this paper says that you can show that moral realism exists from the very popularity of belief in moral realism. I spend the first half of my paper or so arguing that moral realism is near universal. Nearly everyone has an implicit belief in moral realism. Let me actually...
Okay, so keep that in your back pocket, that nearly everyone has did he say implicit belief in moral realism? The terminology and what's being claimed here is going to be important. So let's make sure we get it right.
Realism. I spend the first half of my paper or so arguing that moral realism is near universal. Nearly everyone has an implicit belief in moral realism.
Okay, so we've got, the claim is specifically an implicit belief in moral realism, and it's nearly everyone. This is a nearly universal. Note the caveat, the qualification. It's not literally everyone, it's nearly everyone. So there's some room, there's some allowance for like somebody, presumably, I don't know what he has in mind, but it could be like a psychopath or whatever. Someone with a very abnormal psychology might not be. But, and I don't know exactly what the exclusion criteria would be. I don't know if this is 90%, 98%, and it doesn't need to be that precise. Someone could say, look, I don't know, it's somewhere between 87 and 99.99%. You know, so I'm not going to ping someone for a lack of specificity. If you're making a very general claim, it doesn't have to be super precise. But the claim here is nearly everyone, and no, is implicit belief. So it's not like the expectation to be that everyone goes around going, I'm a moral realist, I'm a moral realist, hey, 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 I'm a moral realist. That would be an unreasonable expectation, and not something that he's claiming or trying to predict or anything like that. Nobody that thinks most people are moral realists thinks that they like explicitly have like thought it through and go, yeah, moral realism, that's the ticket. That's just not something that people would expect. By implicit, I take it that the idea is that something about the way that those people are disposed to think, the way that they speak, the kinds of commitments, and the sorts of things that they would discover about themselves on reflection. They would go, oh yeah, I guess that's the view that I had. So it's a kind of inchoate or nascent view that could be drawn out of people, not a view that they necessarily explicitly endorse.
Let me pull up some sections of this paper and let me show you exactly what I mean by this argument. I guess first I should probably define what I mean by moral realism. I just looked down in my paper and I saw that I had a definition there, and I haven't actually presented that to you yet. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines moral realism as the belief that moral claims do purport to report facts and are true if they get the facts right. In other words, a moral realist is someone who believes that moral statements can be factual, that moral claims can be either true or false. And
okay, so right away we have an issue, and this has been an issue for quite some time. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry on moral realism. To my knowledge, it's written by Jeffrey Sayer McCord. Why don't we double check that? I don't know why that's something I feel like I need to doubt, but let's go have a look. Last updated in 2015, so it's been quite some time. Yep, Jeff Sayer McCord, and it was last updated in 2015. And sure enough, it does give this definition that it only mentions that moral realism is basically the view that people think that there are moral truths. So let's go back over the definition.
And alternative report facts and paper, and I saw that I had a definition there, and I haven't actually presented that to you yet. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines moral realism as report facts and are true if they get the facts right. In other words, a moral realist is someone who believes that moral statements can be factual, that moral claims can be either true or false.
So modern moralist says too limited. That's cognitivism, isn't it? Yeah, it is missing an explicit claim that at least some of those facts are, there actually are some of those facts. So if someone just says moral claims can be true or false, and that they purport to be about what's true or false, that would actually be consistent with error theory, which is not a type of moral realism, and that would be consistent with moral relativism and constructivism. I think Sarah McCord says more. So let's have a look at the beginning of the article. I'll just read it. Where is it? Here. Okay. Moral realists are those who think that in these respects, things should be taken. Okay. You have to read the whole thing for context. Taken at face value, the claim that Nigel has a moral obligation to keep his promise, like the claim that Nix is a black cat, purports to report a fact and is true if things are as the claim purports. Moral realists are those who think that in these respects, things should be taken at face value. Moral claims do purport to report facts and are true if they get the facts right. Okay, so far, yeah, that sounds like cognitivism, because the view that it's like there's a semantic thesis. They purport to report these facts. They're like, what the language is doing is it's an attempt to describe what the facts are, report the facts. And then they are true if they get the facts right. So there's like a conditional there. But that's consistent with none of them get the facts right, which would be error theory. And that's also consistent with the kinds of facts that they are facts about the output of some constructive process of like figuring out what the moral truths are, which would technically be stance dependent. It would be consistent with cultural relativism, individuals, like some subjectivist accounts, that sort of thing. Okay. But note, it continues. Moreover, they hold at least some moral claims are actually true. And so that's what makes it not a type, it's not merely cognitivism, because cognitivism is simply the view that they're capable of being true or false. It doesn't say that any of them in particular are true. So it's not cognitivism because of that second remark. And it's not error theory because it says at least some of them are true. So you rule out cognitivism and error theory on Sarah McCord's account. What you don't appear to explicitly rule out in this first paragraph are relativistic views, because those views are cognitivistic and they're not error theoretic. They do hold that there's at least some moral truths. So the question comes down to whether this sort of definition is like standard. Like there's no such thing, I don't think, as like an incorrect definition. There's nothing wrong with this definition. And I've seen philosophers define it in this way outside of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So it's not like, this is a total outlier. But I do think it's become a little less conventional in the contemporary metaethics discourse. Pretty much everybody whose work I read, this would be Terence Cuneo, Bengtson, Russ Schaefer Landau, Spencer Case, Mike Humer. These are David Enoch, all the prominent moral realists. The way that they tend to characterize it is they include these more robust elements. Now, they'll sometimes draw a distinction between robust moral realism and less robust forms of moral realism, but often those distinctions are drawn on somewhat other grounds. But they too, at least some of them have recognized that sometimes the term moral realism is used more minimalistically to refer to the view that moral claims purport to refer to stance-independent moral facts, and at least some of those facts are true. Something like that. Although, actually, wait, no, that's more than this, because this is just saying, okay, so at least some of them have said, yeah, okay, it's the view that their moral claims purport to report facts, and at least some of those facts are true, which would make it consistent with relativism and that sort of thing. The stance-dependent kinds. There's a couple extra nuances there, but basically what I'm saying is I have seen people say, yeah, sometimes it's used in this way. Unfortunately, there's a lack of consensus about like whether the term should exclusively refer to stance-independent facts, or whether it should exhibit other sorts of characteristics or not. So sometimes people, for instance, will even throw in an epistemic condition, which would be something like, and at least some of these facts are knowable by us. So, then you have an even more robust form of realism. Spencer Case does a good job of basically building a increasingly realist layer cake. Like as you add these conditions on, it's more realisty. And you could peel all back the layers. You could add a little bit of realism, add a bit more. So like the most minimal is there's at least some moral facts, add another layer on, they're stance independent, add another layer on, some of them are knowable. And you get a greater and greater realism. I mean, he may have got that from somebody else. I think I have some dim recollection of him saying something like that. So what can we say about this? Well, I don't think that this definition is incorrect, but I do think it's a less common definition these days. And my guess is that eventually this will be updated to more explicitly refer to stance independence as a core feature of typical ways of construing realism, and that some early and significant clarification work will take place in an article like this to draw a distinction between this more minimalist version and the more robust versions that include stance independence. Okay, let's have a look at the chat. I saw a couple people comment. Does anyone accept the first three and then reject the last epistemic condition? I've never heard of somebody that. So the short answer is not to my knowledge. I've never heard of anybody saying, "Look, I do think that there are stance-independent moral facts, but I don't think there's any way to know what they are." I've never heard of anybody endorsing that view. But you could have someone that says, "Look, it looks to me like they purport to describe stance-independent facts." And I'm not saying there aren't any facts, but if there are, I don't think we have a way of knowing about them. So that would I guess would give you some type of agnostic or skeptic of some kind that thinks that the limiting factor here, like the reason they reject moral realism, would be for epistemic reasons, not for, say, metaphysical reasons. So that's a viable position that probably some people hold, that they think that the key issue here is, look, maybe there are these moral facts, but there's no process available to us to find out what they would be if there were such things. So that's not going to. You could combine that with the view that, and also they don't exist. Like you could endorse you could endorse Mackey's arguments. Well, Mackey has metaphysical and epistemic arguments, so you can endorse both at the same time. But as far as someone actually thinking positively, yeah, realism is true, but I just can't. There's no way to figure out what the facts are. That'd be a weird view. Philosophers are known for sometimes taking weird views, so maybe you could find a person that thinks that. I don't know. All right, let's keep going.
And alternatively, a moral non-realist, or also sometimes called a non-cognitivist, argues that truth or false.
Yeah, see, look at that. He says a non-realist or a non-cognitivist. But he's mixing those two up. I don't know if the article is mixing them up. Let me look at the article. No, it doesn't look like the article's mixing them up. So let's have a look at what he says here.
Statements can be factual, that moral claims can be either true or false. And alternatively, a moral non-realist, or also sometimes called a non-cognitivist, argues that truth or falsity cannot be ascribed to moral.
That's just a mistake. He says also called. So a non-realist and a non-cognitivist would not be the same thing. You could be a cognitivist and a non-realist if you're an error theorist, even with this description. So that just doesn't seem accurate.
Claims. Now, what I then argue is that given this definition of moral realism, it should be immediately clear how strong this position is reflected in our customary uses of moral language.
Notice our customary uses of moral language. Now, everybody, let's do a prediction here. So if you haven't seen this video, is he going to, so when he says our customary practices or our customary way of speaking, what I'd like you to do is give me a prediction. Is he going to give examples of customary practices or ways of speaking about morality in any language other than English? Could be, all it takes is one other language. Could be Portuguese, could be Latin, it could be who knows, anything. Mandarin, French, Basque, could be anything. So take your guesses. I'm only going to give you like a minute for this. Modern moralist, why did you mention Walter Sennett Armstrong? Oh, did you just think I was mixing up Sarah McCord with Walter Sennett Armstrong because that hyphenation's in the name? That's pretty funny. Frank Pickle says English is the language of morality, though. In a way, I don't even know. Well, clearly it's not. It reminds me of people that think like that will be like the Bible was written in English. The King James version is the only version that's ever existed. All right, we got 9 votes. That's enough. Okay, so let's see.
So consider some following formulas for moral statements that we make all the time. You shouldn't do that. That's bad. You should do that. That's good. This punishment is unjust. There's nothing wrong with doing this. That is a good man. These kind of statements form the
Bingo, all English, told you.
Background for many, many. You should do that. That's good. This punishment is unjust. There's nothing wrong with doing this. That is a good man. These kind of statements form the background for many, many, many of the moral claims we make. Yet, these claims, these statements, which aren't atypical by any means for moral claims, present themselves as factual. They present.
Notice what was said. Present themselves as factual. Now, there are multiple layers at which you could describe the psychology and the language of people when claiming that there's some sort of presumption in favor of realism. So first, you could say that there's something about the structure of our language where the best explanation of the linguistic outputs of our practices is to construe them in terms of some sort of commitment to moral realism, so that the way that we speak looks like it exhibits a commitment to realism, whether or not this reflects any psychological reality about either the implicit commitments that people have or the explicit beliefs that they have. So that would be the sort of lowest tier. Then you can move up a level and talk about people's beliefs. Although these, yeah, I guess that would be the highest level. In between those levels, you could talk about our sort of phenomenology or our experiences. Now, let's put them on equal levels. So that's the lowest tier. And then there's two different positions that are qualitatively distinct from one another that are one tier above. One would be our beliefs. So a belief, you could say, give a rough sort of analytic definition, assent to the truth of a proposition. So this would be like holding or regarding or considering some proposition to be true. And so in this case, a belief that moral realism would be true, an explicit belief would be like if you assent, like someone goes, "Are you a moral realist?" You go, "What is that?" You go, "Well, the view that because maybe you don't know the term." And they say it's the view that like what's right or wrong doesn't depend on people's attitudes or values or in the standards of cultures. You go, "Yeah, I believe that." So then you believe that. You assent to the truth of the proposition. It's not just that you speak in a way that the best explanation for the linguistic outputs is, yeah, this looks like realist language. Rather, it's that the person themselves, as a matter of psychological reality, goes, yeah, I endorse realism. And then you have this third one that he refers to here. He says that they present themselves to us as factual. And there you're bringing in something that moves beyond some implicit feature of our language. And it refers to our phenomenology, the way that we experience morality. So the reason I don't want to put this a level above our beliefs is because you could experience morality this way and then reject it. It would be a little harder to have the belief that realism is true. But then, well, no, I guess it wouldn't be. You can believe realism is true, but not have a realist phenomenology. Maybe you're persuaded by the arguments. And you can have realist-like experiences. The same way I could think that I could appear, there appears to be a tree, but I don't believe it's there. It's an illusion. So both of these, you can't really put them on like one or the other higher on the hierarchy. In the second case, you have the experience, or it presents itself to you as true, whether or not you end up endorsing it. And so there's three different things here: the implicit commitments in our language, what people assent to or consider true. And then the third one is what our experiences are like. And here, by saying it presents itself to us as true, he seems to be implying something about our phenomenology or our experiences. Now, note, the moment he does that, if that's intended, and people sometimes speak loosely, maybe they're not as careful with the language that they want to use, and maybe he didn't intend to suggest this. But if we're moving away from some sort of non-psychological description of language, which I consider very bizarre in the first place, I see language as a behavior and meaning to be a matter of intent. So to me, if one word, he's not doing that in any explicit way. If one were to describe language with some non-psychological goal, I'd find that super bizarre. But you could do that in principle. So set that aside. So now the question is he making a psychological claim, a claim about what our phenomenology is like? Because if that's the case, the standard of evidence that you're going to have for that is going to be a lot higher. And you're moving into the realm of making an empirical claim, a claim that is subject to empirical inquiry and isn't the sort of thing that you could readily resolve from the armchair. So maybe if you have so much background empirical knowledge, you could make inferences or you could extrapolate from that knowledge to new cases. Like, for instance, I don't think that we need to conduct like a randomized controlled trial to find out that it's not safe to like throw people into volcanoes. You don't need to do that. We already know that that would not be safe because we know a lot about like heat and gravity and what would happen if a person falls from a great height into something very hot. So you don't need to run a study on that. Now, if you have a whole bunch of theoretical knowledge that would allow you to extrapolate from what you know about human psychology and say, yeah, people endorse realism or have realist phenomenology, that'd be great. Do we have knowledge like that? We don't. So we're going to need direct evidence, or we would need to build up that theoretical knowledge. And what I'll be getting to is, pointing out we don't have that data. We don't have data showing that most people experience morality in a way that presents itself to us as factual.
Themselves as making a definitive claim about the state of the world. As I say in my paper, there's a definitive
note here. He says state of the world. So that also seems to imply something other than, because remember, he was going with the Sarah McCord definition, which seems, without further clarification, to include like relativist accounts. Now, when you say states of the world, does that include states of our own mind? Because if you're a relativist and you say something like stealing is wrong, if you're an individual relativist, then you might mean something like, I would prefer that people not steal. And so now you have a preference on what you're reporting. When he says the state of the world, does that include statements about our preferences? Is he including relativism or not? It's not clear. And so, he said he wanted critical feedback. One piece of critical feedback, well, I'll make a few. One, look into how realism is characterized in the contemporary literature. The Sarah McCord definition from the SEP, I would say, is a little non-standard, and it's not a definition I would run with. I strongly encourage you to look into that. Look at the prominent people publishing on the topic of realism. So people like David Enoch, Mike Humer, Russ Schaefer Landau. Let's get some anti-realists and people with like less robust realist views. Stephen Finlay, Richard Joyce. Get in touch with one of them maybe, or go look at their work. And if you're not clear on it, get in touch with them. A lot of people are real nice. They'll be happy to respond to you. Walter Sinnott Armstrong, and ask them, like, what's the standard way that realism is characterized? Because I don't think the Sarah McCord characterization is standard anymore. Okay, and then the second thing is be careful about what kind of claim you're making. Are you talking about phenomenology? Are you talking about beliefs? Or are you talking about like semantic analysis of ordinary moral discourse? Which one of the three are you talking about? It's important to distinguish those from one another and be very, very clear about what sorts of claims you're making. If you're not careful, you could slip up and say things that you may not intend to say and overcommit yourself to views that the evidence or reasons you give, say, for some analysis of language doesn't really apply to some sort of psychological claim it sounds like you're making. If you're intending to make the psychological claim, then you might need a different set of arguments or considerations to support that claim. All right. Oh, yeah. Of course. How can I forget Don Loeb? Yeah, Lofa says Don Loeb. Of course, Don Loeb. Am I out of my damn mind? So someone is making a good point here. Hudson Dyer is giving similar examples of statements. That food is tasty. This food is tasty. That comedian is funny. Would we take these claims to imply realism about comedy, or realism, like gastronomic realism about what tastes good or bad? I suspect no. And yet they still have the same grammatical structure as the sorts of claims that he just provided. And so you can have a kind of parody argument here, which is a kind of reductio, which is if you want to say that the surface grammar of ordinary moral language implies realism, then you might also have to be committed to saying the same for other sorts of language. Now, you could break the parody by saying, okay, well, it's just that it has that surface grammar, and then there's other sorts of things like Frege-Geach problem, other sorts of considerations like how they handle disagreement. And so maybe the way that people handle moral disagreement differs from the way that they handle comedic disagreement or food disagreement. I actually don't think that happens. I think people argue about what restaurants and what comedians are good or bad all the time. So I actually don't think morality comes out looking too hot in that exchange. I think it actually looks like the lines are pretty blurred in practice. I think philosophers just wildly underestimate how much people argue about like which musicians are good and what food tastes good or bad. And I don't think most of those philosophers are realists about those issues. Okay, let's keep going.
Yes, to the words capital punishment is wrong, which is not found in statements like capital punishment makes me feel icky, or I'm not a fan of capital punishment. A definitiveness which naturally invites the question, well, what's your reason for thinking that? This, at least, is how statements of a moral nature are usually taken. We naturally take these kind of statements as defendable on an evidential basis.
So there's a reason for that is consistent with anti-realism. So let's say I tell you that my favorite flavor of ice cream is vanilla. if you said, well, what's your reason for that? I'm going to look at you funny. And the reason I'm going to look at you funny is because my reason is very shallow. It's, well, it tastes better than, like, I put it in my mouth and I go, ooh, me like. And then if I put other flavors in my mouth, I go, ooh, me like less, or me no like, right? It's very primitive. It's very, you know, someone's going to clip that too and just have a clip of me going, me no like I'm some kind of idiot caveman or something. Now I made it worse doing that shit. Okay. I gotta be like, I'm gonna have like severe clip anxiety at some point. Okay. Anyway, so in those cases, like, the reason is that it produces positive experiences, but it gives me pleasure. But when someone says something like capital punishment is wrong, it's unlikely that the person is just like a direct, really brute particularist that just for any given applied moral issue, they just have a direct position on the matter. Rather, our moral standards on particular issues, like, should we increase the minimum wage, or do people have a right to universal health care? Things that are politicized are often entangled in a web of other commitments and considerations. Same thing for capital punishment. Same thing for abortion. Same thing for many moral issues. Now, the issue then is, well, why do people feel obliged to give, like, why would people feel obliged to give a defense if they're anti-realists, or at least if they're not realists? Well, often those positions are nested and they're extensions of, and they're nested within a broader hierarchy of more foundational principles that a person has. So for instance, a person may say that they are in favor of capital punishment because they believe it's an important deterrent that prevents people, it like discourages people from committing the crimes that cause them to receive capital punishment. And so overall, like, they might say something like, look, my perspective is that every year you execute, 200 people, maybe 10 of them are innocent. That sucks. But you discourage 500 murders from occurring. So on net, you're actually saving a lot of lives. And as a bonus, the lives you're saving are innocent lives, whereas most of the people executed are guilty or something. That would be a rationale someone would give. Now, someone else might come along and say, whoa, 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 whoa. That ratio, they might argue on empirical grounds, the ratio is too low. The number of not guilty people executed is way too high. It's actually higher than that. Or they might argue on deontological grounds that it's morally wrong to implement proposals that, for non-consequentialist rationale, that would lead to any significant number of innocent people being executed, that you have to have the ratio way, 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 way lower, or not at all. Maybe not at all is too high of a standard, but maybe they'd say, look, that ratio you're giving, what is that out of 200? That's 5% or something. It's got to be at 1% or lower. So that person could have some principal reason for thinking that's not good enough. Or they might argue on empirical grounds, it's not an effective deterrent, so it's not reducing crime. Or they might argue on principal grounds, deterrence isn't a legitimate reason, or at least not a sufficient reason for having a particular kind of punishment, that the punishment ought to fit the crime. So you see, you could try to all sorts of reasons why a person might have these other views that are more foundational. And a person could endorse almost any of those more foundational views on anti-realist grounds, right? They could say, well, those are my subjective moral commitments, or they're the result of some constructivist procedure that I endorse, something like that. And so people might be expected to give reasons for why they hold the sorts of views that they have, but it doesn't mean that if you dig all the way back, that you're going to bottom out in some view that they think is stance independently true. You could just bottom out in something that they hold on subjective grounds. So that's a bit different than someone reporting like a food preference. There's just not, food preferences aren't grounded in principles or more fundamental positions. So again, I think when people describe the differences between moral discourse, moral judgment, moral reasoning, moral deliberation, moral argumentation, they often attribute to it, they look at features of it and they go, wow, these make most sense in light of realism. And actually, anti-realists have fairly readily available resources for explaining the same thing in ways that I don't see as any worse. Now, realists might disagree, but that's an argument to be had. It's not, it's not like a realist is in a position here to just come in and bulldoze the answer on the matter and just say, nope, clearly only realism fits with this, anti-realism doesn't fit with this. They say this about disagreement, that like relativists can't make sense of moral disagreement. Yes, they can. They'll look at all these things and say anti-realists can't make sense of this, or they don't do as good of a job of explaining that. I don't agree. They can make sense of it. And, at that point, a realist might say, well, the anti-realist explanation is strained. I don't agree. I don't think that they're strained. I don't think the accounts that I just gave is a particularly strained account. All right, let's keep going. Oh, wait, we got some questions. So Bart, man, people get really nitpicky about phrasing like this. Hey, do you intend, as the title says, to make the stronger claim that most people are not moral realists instead of claim that most people are moral realists is not justified? Yes, I do. I do think that the best explanation for what most people think is that they're neither realists nor anti-realists, and that's a position that I've defended in my work. And then Bart continues, because in that case, you would have to have the psychological data yourself, right? Indeed. Indeed, I do. That's what I wrote my dissertation on.
The very language we use to describe moral claims suggests an implicit belief in moral realism in the background of our moral conversations.
So here's my short response. He simply hasn't done the work to show that this is the case. So he's taken fairly superficial features of ordinary discourse or ordinary moral discourse, which I'll point out. I kind of alluded to this earlier. He's only looked at cases in English, and he's looked at those and said, yeah, it seems to imply realism. We're not seeing much of an argument for this. We're not seeing any serious engagement with how an anti-realist might explain this discourse or how they might make sense of it. I'm not seeing much of an argument here. Yeah, Bart. So I'll just give a quick rundown because, man, tonight is like freeze central. I should get a new webcam. I really should get a new webcam. Maybe the problem is the webcam. Bart, so here's roughly what I did. So there is this empirical literature. It goes back now a little over 20 years. The first paper I could think of is 2003, Nichols and Folds Bennett. And then there's 2004, a paper called After Objectivity, again with Nichols. But the real paper that got the ball rolling was Goodwin and Darley's 2008 paper. I think it's called The Psychology of Metaethics Exploring Objectivism, something like that. I always forget the title. It's a very generic sounding title, which there's nothing wrong with that. And that one's been cited a lot, but it really got the ball rolling. And then Jennifer Wright stepped in the ring with this paper. Wright, McWhite, and Grangian. Wright, Grangian, and McWhite. There we go. 2013. And that paper defended the pluralist account. And then a handful of other papers came out. James Beebe wrote a few papers. Taylor Davis wrote a really great paper that came out a few years ago, which really expanded the range of type of metaethical views that were being explored and sort of cross-checked people's metaethical views with Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. Thomas Pulser has done an enormous amount of work on this topic. But basically what happened is Wright, Pulser, Beebe, and a handful of others noticed that there were methodological shortcomings in some of the early work from Goodwin and Darley and some others. And they started focusing on trying to design studies that mitigate some of these methodological problems. I go into detail about some of them in my work. Pulser gets into some of them in his work. The bottom line is that most of the early studies were very low resolution. They just kind of contrasted relativists with non-relativists, and that didn't tell you a whole lot. They also they fumbled some distinctions. So like one of the early measures in the Goodwin and Darley paper looks more like a measure of cognitivism than realism. So you get kind of pretty easily corrected mistakes like those. And like Beebe, for instance, included non-cognitivism as a response option. It became a common response in for a couple items, it was the modal response, like the most common response. So you get little issues like that. But the big issue is something that David Moss and I pointed out in our 2020 paper, Misunderstanding Metaethics. And what we point out there is that the kinds of issues that philosophers are asking people are abstract, they're removed from everyday life, they're complicated, they're not things that are really salient for people. And when philosophers and psychologists end up asking people these questions in the context of a study, it's not clear what they're asking to participants. And this doesn't mean participants are like stupid or incompetent. The participants of these studies are native English speakers or native speakers of whatever language the study is being conducted in. There's been a little bit of cross-cultural research. So, sorry, I'm saying a lot. Let me grab a drink. They're not incompetent. They're interpreting the stuff as best as they can, but the kinds of questions outside of a philosophical context in the absence of philosophical training are inherently abstract, ambiguous, and difficult to interpret as intended. And so what Moss and I found in our preliminary reanalysis of Goodwin and Darley's data is that their initially reported very low rate of unintended interpretations was much higher than that. And this sort of cracked the dam for me. And I ended up conducting a couple dozen studies I had a couple colleagues, including David, also code the data with me. So we did a kind of qualitative analysis of the data. And then later, we ran some quantitative studies as well. And what we were doing is looking at, do people interpret these questions as intended? And so most of the qualitative analysis I did on my own, unfortunately. So I would love to get extra coders and have other people look at that data. But basically, you know, my interpretation, and basically what I did is I looked at all this data and I interpreted the whole set of data, both the quantitative and quantitative studies. And what I argued is that in a vast majority of cases across all the measures, a substantial majority of people either clearly did not interpret the material about metaethics as intended, or it's not clear, you can't tell. That the rates of intended interpretations are so low that the measures used in these studies are not valid. The studies basically don't work. Now, what's the takeaway from that? So one takeaway might be it's really hard to do this, and if we get better measures, we're going to be able to figure out if people are realists or anti-realists. But what I did is I took a step back and said, well, hold up now. What would prompt us to think that when people make moral claims that they've got to be a realist or an anti-realist, or that there has to be a determinate answer in virtue of the way that they're speaking that would commit them to one or another of different analyses of the language? This is something I was heavily inspired by Michael Gill's paper from 2009, Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics, and later Don Loeb's work on moral incoherentism. When I looked at that, I thought, okay, well, from a purely like, let's sit down in the armchair and analyze language, I think realists think that they have an edge, and I don't think that they do. And I could show you one recent study that proposes some features of the way English, and in fact, some non-English languages work that all seem to be, at least to the extent that they have in their analysis, with an anti-realist account. So that's a problem. The data, even from the armchair, is mixed. But when you look at the empirical data, it's not like people are unambiguously and consistently inclined towards endorsing realism or anti-realism. They give these weird mixed responses. They don't appear to interpret the questions as intended. And so, from a purely like armchair analysis perspective, I don't think realism wins. And then from a sort of psychological perspective, it doesn't look to me like there's any particularly good theoretical reason to think people would need to be realists or anti-realists implicitly or explicitly to engage in moral discourse or do any of the things that they do with moral language. And so what I propose is, if you take a step back, you zoom out and you look at the whole body of data, the best explanation for the data is that people are not realists or anti-realists. That's the best. So it's an abductive argument. And the comparison to be to something like, when people make causal claims, there's no particularly good reason to think that they have to be committed to an interpretation of quantum mechanics, like the Copenhagen or the many worlds or hidden variable interpretations. That'd be ridiculous. And if you want to get something more close to home on language, like when people talk about, hey, I think it might rain tomorrow, do they have to be committed to like A theory of time or B theory of time? You might think B theory of time is like weird and people probably don't think that or something. But do they have to have a specific commitment about how time works in order to make that claim? No. And so, if you look at the linguistic outputs, they could be consistent with both theories of time. If you look at the person's explicit beliefs, they might go, I don't know what the hell those theories of time are. And if you look at implicit beliefs, well, what the hell is an implicit belief? Are you going to unpack their skull and find that they have a little belief hidden in there somewhere? I mean, beliefs are cashed out in terms of people's behavior and the things they're disposed to say. And you might think, okay, well, maybe if you explained it to people, they'd be disposed to choose A theory over B theory. Okay, in what context? What kind of explanation are you giving them? There's no theoretically neutral way to present this information to people. At least I don't think that there is. And so what I think would actually be happening is that you would be sort of collapsing the philosophical wave function. And this is a point that I make in the paper, in such a way that you break them one way or another in a way that's systematically biased. I don't think there's an unbiased way to do this. So I would say that they're prior to exposure to philosophy, that people's beliefs on a wide range of philosophical matters, including free will, consciousness, and metaethics, exist in a state of, I say, a philosophical superposition that's collapsed only by doing philosophy. They don't have implicit beliefs. So I don't think people are realists or anti-realists. I think that's the best explanation for the data. And I could be totally wrong about this, but I haven't seen anything compelling that's come out in the past few years to suggest otherwise. There have been new studies, and I don't find any of them convincing. I think they are continuing to recapitulate the same methodological problems as early studies. In fact, it looks like most people have ended up just ignoring David Moss and Beebe and myself and Polsler and Wright and just continue to run mostly fairly bad measures for the most part. Hudson says, do you know if there's any cross-linguistic analysis of moral claims and or intuitions? Cross-linguistic in what sense? Like with respect to meta-ethics, or like for the types of measures I'm talking about, or for other sorts of analyses of language? The answer to the latter is probably is like yes, but I don't know a whole lot about it. The answer to the former is also yes. So BB and a couple other people, some collaborators, did a cross-cultural study. I believe that they gathered data on how people respond to these kinds of questions in the United States, Poland, Ecuador, and China. There's a paper from 2011 called Folk Moral Relativism from Sarkisian, Nichols, and Nobe, I think. Sarkisian, I forget who the other authors are. But Sarkisian and Nobe, Sarkisian is definitely on. I'm pretty sure Nobe is on it. We could look it up, but I'm not going to. It's called Folk Moral Relativism, and they did cross-cultural research in the United States and Singapore. And then Thomas Polser with some collaborators. I think this is a preprint. It's not published yet. Did some research with some people on how people think about this stuff in Japan. And I think they more recently, I think they also did some cross-cultural studies in a couple other countries, but I can't remember which ones. So there has, they found super high rates of anti-realism, Polser's studies. BB's, I think, found pretty mixed results. It wasn't like this, like everybody's everybody's a realist the moment you leave the United States. That's not happening in those studies. They find the kind of mixed results that early studies found. And Sarkisian et al. Have kind of a complicated results where what they did is they asked people to consider a disagreement between, this was between subjects and within subjects. So sometimes people were in one of the conditions, sometimes they were in all three, but they had 6 studies in that paper. And they varied some things and they tested some other things to rule out some confounds. Anyway, the main thing that was a consistent theme through their studies was that you were asked to consider disagreement either or all three of yourself and a person from the same culture, yourself and a person from a very different culture. It was considered like an indigenous warrior tribe that lived in the rainforest. And then the third category was a weird group of aliens called pentars. And they don't have any like standard human. They only want to turn everything in the universe into equilateral pentagons, including like if one of them dies, they don't even care. They just turn them into pentagons. So very culturally weird. And what they found is with increasing cultural distance that the realist or objectivist rates go down and the relativist rates go up. So what does that tell you about people? Is that some kind of weird non-diagnostic framing effect where like depending on how you frame the question, people give a different answer? Or is it that people are actually more inclined towards relativism? You just have to make it salient to them. I don't know. It's hard to interpret this stuff. Okay. And as far as cross linguistics, there is a really cool paper because you just said morality. Bernie Eunice has this really, really cool paper. So let me see if I could get this one. And I'll throw this one in the chat because this is one of my favorite papers. It's very, very interesting. Yeah, here it is. It's called Mongolian Yos Sertikun and Weird Morality. And what they argue in this paper is that the Mongolian language does not have any direct cognate term as a sort of standard feature of the language for like Western conceptions of morality. That they have their normative concepts are not perfectly overlapping with Western conceptions, which is not to say that they don't have norms or that people there don't have similarly like they're in favor of pro-social stuff and against antisocial stuff. They absolutely are. But if you ask them for like exemplars or prototypical cases of normative violations, they're not going to typically pick the same sorts of things as people say from the United States. So this is, have a look at the paper. It's really, really cool. So let me see if I can pin that. It's a cool paper. Bart says, right, why would lay people have a view on meta-ethics? Yeah, I don't think that they would. Although a lot of philosophers say, look, we're not saying people have views on these things. We're interested in their intuitions and we're interested in what's implicit in the way that they speak. And I don't even think either of those favor realism or anti-realism. I think people are neither. For the most part, obviously, every once in a while, a person is like, maybe it doesn't depend on culture. And so even if they haven't read any philosophy or talked to a philosopher. So I don't think that this is some sort of universe, like zero people without that haven't like read Plato are realists. No, some of them are. And there might be whole communities of people where, depending on their religion or what they read or what they're exposed to, could think in these particular ways. I just think, generally speaking, people don't have any determinate view. Okay. Bart says, fascinating. Thanks for the summary of your research on this. No problem. Hudson says, thanks for the really in-depth response. That's exactly the sort of paper I was looking for. Do you mean the Bernie Eunice paper? Look into that research team's other work, because they have a bunch of other stuff on free will too, and it's super cool. They're running some kick-ass studies. Okay, let's keep going with the video. We're here to watch this video.
And then I go on to argue later in this paper that the fact that we're willing to engage with these claims on a factual basis, the fact that it's considered to be a good response to the claim that capital punishment is unjust, for example, to say, well, no, here's some evidence that capital punishment is not unjust. The fact that we operate this way suggests even more so that our natural inclination is to treat moral claims as if they're grounded in fact, as if they're factual claims.
Yeah, again, though, like this is recall what I was saying before. As an anti-realist, if someone said to me, why are you against this or that policy? I don't want to pick out a policy or something like that. Let's just say, imagine a person is an anti-realist, and imagine that person's an anti-realist, and that person says that they are anti-abortion or whatever. And you ask that person, why are you anti-abortion? That person could say, because they think life begins at conception. And then you could ask them why they think life begins at conception. And then they could give some other answer and some other answer. The fact that when you peel back the layers, people have further answers or would make further appeals does not mean that the person's a realist. It just means that the person's applied ethical views are rooted in more fundamental moral principles that they could hold for any particular reason that's consistent with realism or anti-realism. And when it comes down to it, let's say you had two people arguing about abortion or capital punishment or raising the minimum wage or whatever the policy or attitude or moral issue is. It could bottom out in them both actually thinking on entirely subjective grounds that what matters is, say, maximizing utility. And so then it becomes an empirical question. Like, let's say they both agree their goal is to maximize utility. Do you think two people that, in other words, have the exact same normative moral theory are never going to argue with one another? Of course they're going to argue with one another. Utilitarians argue all the time because they argue about the non-moral facts. And so in a lot of cases, disputes come down to disagreements over the non-moral facts. In addition, people will often make intersubjective appeals. So if I am appealing to your values, like if I say, hey, you shouldn't do that, and they go, why? Well, that would be dishonest, and you shouldn't be a dishonest person. Now, does that presuppose, because I'm not just talking about what I want to do, I'm talking about what I want them to do and what I expect them to want to do. Does that imply I'm a realist? No, because here I'm operating in the assumption, well, I care about honesty, and I believe that my friend or the person I'm talking to cares about honesty. And so I'm making an intersubjective appeal. I'll give a comparison. Let's say that you saw someone as a trick dump a whole bunch of salt into someone's food before serving it, or they put like 50 anchovies in it or something like that. And then they served it to someone. Now you might warn the person, hey, whoa, don't eat that. Someone put a bunch of anchovies in it or a bunch of salt in it. If you want to get real gross, let's say someone spit in it. Although there's going to be moral and safety issues there. So let's stick with anchovies and salt. Now, I actually think like anchovy flavor is a good flavor. I like super salty things, but I also recognize most people don't like anchovies or that kind of flavor. They don't like super umami, super salty type of flavor. Like I've eaten miso paste with a spoon. Like I like super salty stuff. So if you saw someone do that to someone else's food, you might warn the person. Now, why would you warn the person? Do you have to think? In other words, you're not appealing to your own preferences. You're appealing to like what that you expect that person's preferences to be. It's not because you think that there are stance independent facts about what tastes good or bad. It's because you recognize, hey, I'm a human, they're a human. Humans generally have pretty similar palates and physiology. They're probably not going to like super salty or anchovy flavored food. And so you would warn them on that basis. You basically extrapolate from I understand what human taste profiles are like, and I think that that person's not going to like it. That's an intersubjective appeal. It's not an objective appeal. And so the same thing can happen when we're appealing to other people's moral sensibilities, is that we're appealing to, you could say, the better angels of their nature. We're expecting that person to care about being honest or having integrity or being courageous or exhibiting virtues or not wanting to be regarded as a bad person or to not be a bad person, regardless of how they're regarded. And so in all those cases, social norm and moral norm enforcement are often built on the back of, or could be built on the back of, the presumption of shared value, even if those values ultimately are not objective or stance independent. So again, there seems to be this presumption that argumentation or the fact that we appeal to principles, that this somehow alludes to or implies a commitment to realism. It doesn't. It could just allude to or imply a commitment to background or more foundational subjective principles or constructivist views. And when we engage with others, to intersubjective, like presumptions about shared or intersubjective values. So we really don't need to posit realism to account for any of this. And this isn't just speculative. I think that we are, well, maybe it is a bit, but I think that we are probably doing that in the case with food preference situations, where we do in fact treat them as broadly intersubjective. When a person says the food at this restaurant sucks, and you say, you wouldn't just go, okay, your subjective preference. You might say, why does the food suck? And the person says, well, it took them 40 minutes to bring our food out. It was cold. It was really undersalted. There was very little seasoning. It was really bland. Something like that. Now, that doesn't sound good to me. Does it sound good to you? Do I even need to do a poll on this? No, I don't, because I know that most people don't want to eat bland, underseasoned, undersalted, cold food. Cold food that's supposed to be like, it's not ice cream. It's like a, some type of give me 1 second. Okay, guys, I am going to have to go in about 5 minutes so I'm going to have to wrap things up, and I'll have to continue this with a second video. Where was I at? Oh, right. Intersubjective appeals. I was saying something about that. I lost my train of thought. I got to go. Anyway, I got to go deal with some stuff. Okay. I forget what I was talking about. What was I talking about? Salt. Okay. I think I'm belaboring the point. The point here is that I can point to cases where we probably would not think that people have to be realists about that domain of discourse in order to make sense of the discourse. The discourse exhibits characteristics and analogous to moral discourse, and we would make sense of them in terms of intersubjective appeals. So we could do that for taste type things. Oh, right. And I was going to say, look, people write like restaurant reviews, right? And so when they write a restaurant review and they say that the food sucks, they're not just, pissing into the wind and just throwing a view out there. They're expecting other people to be responsive to the same right? So they're expecting people to, like, if they read that the food is cold and unsalted, that those people are going to go, yeah, that's not good. So anyway, I'm belaboring the point. You get the idea. So let's get a couple more minutes out of this, and then we'll wrap it up there.
So, okay, we naturally assume that moral realism is true. Is basically what I'm coming to at the end of that whole discussion. The question then is, how could we get from there to the idea that moral realism is true? How does
Great. That actually worked out well, because that's a natural stopping point. So we got from the claim that most people are moral realists, that's to, okay, how do we get from there to the claim that realism is true? So I will stop there. That was very convenient. It's serendipitous. So we'll wrap things up there. Any more comments, questions, stuff in the comments for me to address? And then we'll wrap things up there. Man, that was a weird, today was weird. I don't know. All right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we could wrap it up there. I'm not seeing more comments. So what was the person's name? Is Thomas? Yeah, Thomas. So I'll throw a comment over in your video. But the bottom line is this, and I'll wrap up the video by saying this. The question of whether or not most people believe moral realism is true, or have experience morality as a realm of fact. It's the way like William Lane Craig frames it, where it presents itself to them in a way that suggests realism, or the way that people speak, suggesting some sort of commitment to realism, implicit or explicit. I take the bulk of those claims to be empirical claims. There is empirical research. This is what I specialize in. So I work in psychology and philosophy, and I, in particular, specialize in the study of whether or not non-philosophers, people without significant training in philosophy, are moral realists or endorse moral realism or are implicitly committed to moral realism. I deal with the whole gaggle of claims there. Now, I ended up in this video, as an aside, talking about my research on this, but this is what I do research on. And there's a whole literature on that. And it's not just my perspective. There is very little, if you look at what other people's conclusions and interpretations of the literature are, there just isn't a whole lot of evidence that most people are moral realists. There's very little evidence that most people speak like moral realists. There's very little evidence that most people think like moral realists. There's very little evidence that they experience morality in any particular way. In that particular case, there's been almost no research on whether people have realist phenomenology. So we need more of that. But at the bottom line is we just don't have research on that. And then as far as people believing it, most people have struggled to even interpret the questions as intended. And so it's not at all clear that it is the case that most people are moral realists. But the bottom line is that if someone wants to make that claim, I would expect a lot better evidence than armchair, like non-empirical analysis of only the English language. There are over 7,000 languages in the world. And Thomas goes on to say like something about like everybody throughout history were mostly realists. We don't have the kind of historical and anthropological data to sustain those claims. It'd be very difficult to show that people today are moral realists, even if we conducted surveys. But we can't do surveys on people that are dead. So what we have is the like historical record. And it's just, there's not enough information in that record to tell us whether most people historically were moral realists or not. Now, sometimes people might make the mistake of thinking, well, they got to be more realists because surely it's more implausible that they're moral anti-realists. But no, I'm not saying they're anti-realists. I'm saying they're neither. You don't have to have a position on this. Most people throughout history didn't have a position on like whether the Loch Ness monster exists because it's not something that they would have considered. You might say most people have had moral language, so realism or anti-realism would be implicit in the way that they spoke. Is that true? Like, how do we know that that's true? When was that shown to be true? And is it in fact the case that most people have moral concepts or speak in moral terms? Well, then we need to ask questions about what do we mean by that? So there is work by Stephen Stitch, who argues that there's no such thing as the moral domain. So there's no distinct category of moral judgments in the first place. Edward Mashery has a paper. It's in the same volume. It's called The Atlas of Moral Psychology. The editor is Kurt Gray. Great volume. And in that same volume, where Stitch has an article just called The Moral Domain, Mashery has an article called Morality, a Historical Invention. And what he argues is that the very concept of morality is a cultural artifact that was invented and only arose in some cultures. It doesn't exist in some other cultures. The link I provided, it might even still be pinned, from Bernie Eunice and other colleagues, provides empirical evidence that is consistent with that claim. And there's growing empirical evidence that suggests that different societies may have different conceptions of how to delineate different normative domains and categories. And, so there's a whole bunch of converging lines of evidence that suggests basically something like this. The way in which philosophers, perhaps yourself, myself, and other people that do a lot of this work in the analytic and predominantly English-speaking tradition, the way that we think about these things, the way that we speak about these things is it's extremely parochial. We have a tendency to think in broadly, like you could say, Anglo-centric terms. And what we don't have is a lot of data. For instance, his entire analysis was on English language. You would have to sit down and do analysis of a bunch of other languages to see how much the language of all these other languages actually appears to exhibit realist-like characteristics implicit in the discourse, the moral discourse in that language. It's another question whether it even has any distinctive or recognizably moral discourse rather than some other normative domain. So those are two empirical questions. Third, there's an empirical question about whether the psychology of predominantly English or native English speaking people in, say, the United States generalizes to the psychology of people outside of the United States, or historical populations, or indigenous populations in different parts of the world, or populations that don't speak English, or populations that haven't been exposed to Christianity, or populations that are committed to some particular religion, or are culturally or linguistically isolated. Humanity is really diverse. They're linguistically diverse, they're culturally diverse, they're conceptually diverse. it may or may not be the case that most people throughout history are realists. But if you wanted to show that most people today or most people in the past are realists, you're going to need substantial cross-cultural and cross-linguistic data. And the bottom line is we don't have anything even scratching the surface of that data. Nothing even close. Probably less than 10 languages we've even done this kind of research in. So even if you wanted to set aside all my arguments in my work, like we just don't have enough data one way or another. And so I think there's something very strange about people thinking that the way that they think about morality is the way that everybody thinks about morality, without really doing the work to show that that's the case. All right, so we'll wrap it up there. Thanks everybody for being here. And yeah, I got stuff I gotta go get doing. So catch y'all later. Take care.